Hi, my name's Mabel Anstine. I'm going to be a junior studying mechanical engineering at K-State this year, and today I'm going to be presenting my summer research, which is over the investigation of the cross-linking mechanism and the evolution of the carbon phase during pyrolysis of linear oligosiloxanes. So first, just a brief overview of everything I'm going to touch on. So I'll talk about the significance and the objective of my project going into the summer. I'll talk about the process that I did and focus on the characterization and analysis of the data I was able to collect. And then lastly, I will make some conclusions and also talk about what I'm going to do moving forward. So first, I did want to touch on the significance and the objective of my research going into the summer. So over the past 50 years or so, the interest regarding polymer-derived ceramics has greatly increased, with many exciting developments and new applications in industry for PDCs. And the evolution of the excess carbon phase is a phenomenon which becomes independent of the other phases throughout the polymer-to-ceramic process. So I kind of have an image of that process down here. So you can see here at a lower temperature, the carbon phase is still somewhat connected here. And then as you increase the temperature, the carbon phase becomes independent. And this is something that's going to greatly impact the properties and the applications of PDCs. So learning more about this carbon phase and using it in an advantageous way can allow an improvement of properties and the development of new applications. So that's why I'm kind of looking into this. And then the carbon phase can actually be controlled by changing the precursor's microstructure. So by looking at different oligosiloxanes, I'm kind of examining that as well. And so some of the changes to the properties can be controlled by that as well. And I'm also investigating the cross-linking mechanism of polymers in order to better understand the polymer to ceramic process and to see the changes in the material's microstructure. So for this project, I've been assigned 3 different precursors. So I've studied TBTS, which is 1,3,5-trivinyl, 1,1,3,5,5 pentamethyl trisiloxane 95%. You can see that here. I've studied TDS, which is 1,3-divinyl tetramethyl disiloxane, which is here, and then 1,5-divinyl 3,3-diphenyl 1,1,5,5 tetramethyl trisiloxane, which is this DDTS, which you can see right here. So these precursors were chosen because they've been studied by one of my colleagues, Shakir, due to their chemical stability and their flexibility of use. All of them have oxygen in their backbone, so they're relatively easy to use, especially in just an open environment. So he has added a spinning agent to these precursors in order to study spun fiber mats. So I wanted to study the ceramization process of the neat precursor without that spinning agent. And these precursors are all oligosiloxanes. So they begin as oligomers, which are made up of a silicon and oxygen backbone, which you can see in all of these figures here, with varying organic side groups. And we can also see the molar mass and the boiling point of each of these precursors. So just for reference, because I've subjected them to some pretty high temperatures, and the molar mass will be important when we are talking about the mass yield later on. So for my experimentation, I added a 1 weight percent of dicumyl peroxide, or DCP, to act as a catalyst in each of the oligomers. So it's a polymerizing agent as the precursors again begin in that oligomer form. I then cross-linked some of my samples in air and some of them in argon, both at 180 degrees Celsius. But for this research, I'm just focusing on those cross-linked in air as it aligns with the previous work done in the lab with those spun fiber mats. And after they cross-linked, I crushed them into some finer particles in preparation for pyrolysis at either 800 degrees Celsius or 1200 degrees Celsius in argon in our furnace. And you can see kind of that evolution of this process here in this figure 3. And following this process, I used a few different analysis techniques so that I could better understand that cross-linking mechanism, as well as see the changes in the carbon phase throughout the heat treatment process. So I used FTIR to analyze the cross-linking behavior and also to characterize the chemical structure by looking at the bonding of each of the precursors. So the results here confirm the types of bonds that were expected and also show the relative amount of bonding in each precursor. So the peaks here are labeled by wave number, as you can see, and the chart on the right shows which bonds the main peaks are indicative of. And we can see the differences between each of the precursors in this figure. So DTDS, the red, which has the lowest molecular weight, is going to have a low peak intensity due to a lower amount of each functional group found in the precursor. And then the DTS in the green here is going to show its differences by the additional peaks, such as at 1430 here and at 1118. And those are going to be indicative of the phenyl groups that are only found in that DDTS material. So you can see the differences of each of the precursors in this chart here. And then I've also used FTIR to show the changes following heat treatment to each of the precursors. So you can see here in this figure that following cross-linking, the intensity of the peaks is decreasing pretty much across the board, which indicates the breakdown of certain bonds in the material, which could be due to decomposition reactions such as dehydrogenation. And I also wanted to point out that we can see the beginning of the breakdown of some of the hydrocarbon groups in each of these as well. And that's going to indicate the beginning of the formation of that free carbon phase, because the excess carbon is formed by the breakdown of hydrocarbons. However, excluding the hydrocarbon bonding, there are still pretty strong absorption bonds for the other main bondings within the samples. So you can see that, for example, with the TPTS here, this bond is really not converted too much. So there's still some conversion that needs to happen here. And to exemplify kind of all of this, I've calculated the conversion yield of the major bonds in each sample. And you can see that the samples with the weaker bands, like right here, have much higher conversion yields, so like the hydrocarbons. So Raman spectroscopy is going to allow for the characterization of the carbon phase within these materials. So here I have a DTS sample pyrolyzed at both 800 and 1200 degrees Celsius. And when comparing the peaks of the pyrolyzed material, the data for the 1200 is much clearer, as you can see, than the data for the 800, which shows that there are actually going to be more peaks under the ones shown here, which is going to mean that there is less graphitic or ordered carbon at this temperature, and there's going to be more ordered carbon at this higher temperature as these bands are becoming much more obvious. And if I had some curve fitting under here, you would be able to see those additional peaks. So that's something that I'm going to work on in the future. And we can also see here that as temperature increases, the ratio of intensity of the D peak to the G peak decreases, which is going to again confirm the idea that as temperature increases, the carbon is becoming more graphitic in nature, which is indicative of the formation of a free carbon phase. So as for some imaging, here we have a high resolution image of the pyrolyzed TPTS and the corresponding EDX spectra, which again just further confirms the expected elements present, which are going to be silicon, oxygen, and carbon. We can also see a small peak, which represents copper, which was present in the grid, which was used for the TEM analysis. But again, this data is just going to further confirm that initial molecular structure. And finally, we're just going to look at some of the mass yield of the oligosiloxanes. So you can see a few things here. The first is that DDTS and TPTS have far higher yield than the DTDS sample after both cross-linking and pyrolysis. And this was true for every sample I performed. The DTDS had a much lower mass yield just in general. And as the DTDS has a much lower molecular weight than the other two, this was expected. Again, if you look at the structure here, there's just much less of it. So that kind of makes sense. The second thing is that there was a great deal of mass loss across the board after cross-linking, which was not really expected. And this could be due to some fragmentation of the linear oligomer, which would produce some volatilization, which would result in some of that mass loss. So in summary, I studied various oligosiloxanes to learn about their cross-linking and also about the evolution of the excess carbon in their microstructure. I was able to do some characterization by FTIR, Raman, and EDX, which allowed me to draw the following conclusions. So first, the FTIR spectra confirms the cross-linking mechanism that I was looking into, as it shows the breakdown and altering of certain groups of bonds. And the Raman data has also shown that the ordered excess carbon phase appears to increase at higher temperatures, which was consistent with expectation as well. The elemental analysis from TEM confirms the elemental makeup, which is going to be silicon, oxygen, and carbon. And the most surprising of these results was that the mass yield shows mass loss across the board following cross-linking. And this was surprising as many of the other siloxanes studied in our lab have a very high mass yield following pyrolysis. So this is definitely going to require some further investigation. And lastly, DTDS samples have the lowest yield following both cross-linking and pyrolysis. So in future experimentation, I would like to prevent some of this mass loss by either finding a better catalyst for the polymer to ceramic process, or possibly by performing pyrolysis in an autoclave or some other type of closed environment to prevent loss of some of that vaporous material. And I would also like to perform my pyrolysis in situ to better understand what mass lost at what temperature. So I would do this using a thermal gravimetric analyzer coupled with a mass spectrometer, so that I could also see which elements or functional groups are kind of leaving. So that's what I'm planning on doing, as well as further analyzing some of the data that I do already have here. And these are my acknowledgements. So thank you guys for listening.